Hey folks, thanks for joining. My name is Troy Yusada. Welcome to our regenerative home gardening show, or discussion, I should say. Like many of you, I've recently gotten into gardening. I made some robust garden boxes. I went to the local big box store, looked down the aisle of soils bags, chose which one I thought I should get, but not really quite sure. And then I picked out my plants. Let's see. I got lettuce, I got arugula, got some basil and some other herbs, typical stuff that I thought, I'm going to use. But after talking to some buddies, I realized that, I want to make this as efficient as possible. And I don't want to waste money. I don't want to use a ton of water. So what I did is I've invited Ed Lewis and Ron McCord to this discussion. And Ed Lewis, many of you might know him from the body surfing community. He does enjoy hand planes, but he also owns a 9-acre regenerative fruit farm out in Valley Center. Then I brought in Ron McCord, who is a soil wizard, I like to say, and a master of bokashi. So first, I'm going to hand it over to Ed. He's going to tell us about his garden and what he's been up to. Ed, are you there?
I'm here. Hey, Troy, how you doing?
Good, good.
Let's see if I can get some slides over to you. So my background story is that I think since 2009, I've been feeding my family out of growing stuff in my yard. And I lucked out, I had some neighbors that were really good gardeners, and they kind of just pointed the way for me. And so in 2013, this is Karen and myself, we moved to a project. We moved to this kind of a fixer-upper place. And as you can see, it's a big lawn. Now, it had a couple star players in there. There was a macadamia nut, a grapefruit tree, a couple other fruit trees, but basically it was really kind of a dead soil monoculture lawn. And right off the bat, we did what everyone does. We, like a good upcycler that I am, I built a bunch of boxes out of reclaimed wood, and we bought a bunch of soil and went to our garden place and just, planted it out, because this is what you did if you wanted to grow some food. And so, we had some success with this. The first year, the boxes just went nuts, and we thought this was great. We thought, we were doing it right. And so then we kind of had this pivot point in our lives where one night on Netflix, we discovered this film called The Fruit Hunters. And after watching that show or that movie, it was pretty amazing. There was a guy in there that talked about wanting to have a garden that basically fed him fruit year round. And it was all about these crazy rare fruits. And this sort of seeded something in my life where ultimately I ended up with a rare fruit farm. But it got us talking about, okay, so we've been buying these annual vegetables and, putting all this into our boxes, but every year they would die. And so what about putting fruit trees? And so fast forward, this is what our front yard looks like now. It kind of looks like maybe an abandoned lot to some of our neighbors. I don't know, we're not your classic.
Yeah, Ed, how many of your neighbors complained about that?
I can tell you a story later, but yeah, basically we got cited by the city as a fire hazard like a year ago, which actually was a bonus because it made me put a bunch of annuals that I had going to seed in the ground, and I'll show you later about what that actually did. But essentially what it did is it forced me to kind of drop a bunch of seed in the ground, and now I have a garden that I call a forage garden, and I'll show more of that later. But now what we have is, we're about 5 years in. After every year we just invest in trees. So there's a saying that says the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time is today. And so I kind of took that to heart. And every year for Christmas, we would buy bare root fruit trees or other trees and start planting them out. And so it's kind of funny because as a kid, a lot of you probably read this book or are reading it to your children now. This is how I feel. Like I always identified with this character in this book, but where the wild things are, like this is me walking around my garden, but I'm shoving food into my mouth, and I love the canopy of it, and I love the wilderness wildness of it. And so basically over time, we just started learning about putting food into our soil, which is basically our own food waste, through the bokashi composting method. And we just started putting that in the ground. We started mulching like crazy, and essentially our whole grass, our grass, kind of desert land turned into this oasis. So now we've got fruit. We've got about 100 plus fruiting things in our yard and climbing. We're nowhere near done, but that's sort of our story about how we got going.
Ron, let's hear your story.
So yeah, I was just talking to Ed about this, and my story is kind of similar, I guess, because I did a lot of traveling over the past 20 years or so, and I've gone to a lot of places that are tropical. I love tropical places. I love eating tropical fruits. And when I moved here from, I was actually overseas. I moved here, and the ability to grow all these things kind of showed themselves. And my wife and I, we took a trip to Africa, and everybody had a papaya tree, a garden, or a farm that was connected to their property. And I said, when I get back, I'm at least going to have a small garden and a papaya tree in my front yard. And then that changed over to a small space that ended up having, I think, over 200 different things growing in maybe like 250 square feet of space. And it just consumed me to be able to, one, grow a garden with the least amount of work as possible. And that's what kind of took me on this path of sustainability and regeneration, because one of the things I noticed when I travel is a lot of the plants that are growing don't require a lot of inputs. They kind of sustain themselves and keep going. So I wanted to bring that to my home.
Now I see this is a picture of your home quite a years back, right, Ron?
Yeah, this was in 2014. And this was yesterday.
Whoa.
So a pretty big change. And the first real trees didn't get planted in the yard until 2016. So about 4 years is the transformation from a bare yard to my little tropical oasis.
Ron, what can you name off a couple of the species that you've got going on in there? I'm seeing some bananas, and what else?
The bananas, there's bottle brush there. There's the yellow flowers in the front. That's popcorn senna, or African senna. Smells like buttered popcorn when you touch the leaves. It's a bean tree that basically, it needs nothing. It almost needs like no care. And you drop a seed in the ground, and in my yard at least, 2 years later, it's 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide. There's lots of blackberries. There's blueberries up there. The large tree there to the left is a elderberry, and then that one big tree right in the center, blocking the left side of the house, is called it's a tree daisy. And it started as just a little weed that was in a avocado seed pot that I was doing some experimenting with, and it was just 2 inches tall. I dropped it in the ground. A month later, it was 6 feet tall. 3 months later, it was 13 feet tall. So yeah,
you also have coffee. Do you have coffee growing too?
Yeah, I have coffee over in my food forest there. I have bananas, guavas, papaya. I don't even count anymore what all is there because it kind of always changes, and I'm always adding and taking away as the landscape kind of expresses itself in different ways.
So guys, I got a few questions. Clearly, this isn't what I had imagined with my garden boxes. And I'm not sure my neighbors would be quite as comfortable as yours. I have a question from Matt, which is along the lines of mine, is there a way to design these forage gardens in a more aesthetic manner?
Yeah,
aesthetics are in the eye of the beholder.
Well, I'll tackle that one. And one of the cool things about just regenerative agriculture or regenerative home gardening is that you're basically using everything to its best ability. You're not throwing all your green waste in your green bin and sending it to the landfill and letting your water run off your property and go down the street. So a really good example of aesthetically pleasing garden space is like a rain garden. You have a depression that's in your area where water runs into, and that water soaks in and nourishes trees. And at the same time, you're growing food in that space if you want to, or food for nature. But basically, you can design a very small space. Even a planter box can be a regenerative method of growing, and it can be as aesthetically pleasing as you want it to be. What do you say, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that our, your and my style is very different than what most people are into. My goal that I'm sort of reaching now is that I'm really looking for a system that is wild, because what I realized, especially this year, was that in my environment, I was letting sort of nature take over, and I figured out that when I did that, it actually started planting stuff for me. So we started out very controlled. We started out in boxes and doing that sort of style of gardening. And then I guess what sort of won me over was sort of the fact that I stopped having to plant things myself. So I wasn't going to the garden store anymore. For example, all of these arugula seeds, we had let our garden store plants go up, and then they went to seed, and then they planted out, and they just started reseeding itself. And so I found, this is beets, and this is kale. This all just came up on its own. So me personally, I'm going for something totally different. I'm going for sort of this wild system that's really going to reseed itself and feed me, and I want to just kind of go in there and forage. Yeah. But I've seen amazing systems that are completely manicured and completely regenerative. So you can really do it for anybody can fit it into their yard.
So I got a few more questions for you guys. With all that going on, how do you guys choose? I got a question from Danielle. It's like, how do you choose a plant to put next to the other? And also, how do you guys deal with the rodents and the gophers and the insects when it comes to this regenerative gardening?
Ron, you want me to take that first, or you?
Yeah, you go first, and then I'll jump in.
So, okay, so I don't know who has seen that movie, The Biggest Little Farm, but what I kind of figured out, and when we saw that movie, if you've seen it, we were laughing during it because they talk about the basically integrated pest management, which Ron turned me onto that term. But basically what that means is that you are letting nature come in and choose who lives and dies in a lot of ways. And so when you talk about where to plant things, a lot of this stuff, like we didn't start off going to gardening school and then come and do this. We've just been literally observing nature for me, it's been 7 years of attempting this stuff. We've just been observing, and then from doing that, you just start to see patterns. So for example, I've got, let's see if I can pull up a picture of this. I've got a place that we planted a persimmon tree, and this persimmon tree was just, that's all it was just a tree. And then what happened was that birds came in and they dropped some seed, and now this is mustard greens that came up on its own. And if you see these little orange flowers, this is nasturtium. And then I planted a tree collard, which is basically a perennial green machine. This thing puts off collard greens, really tasty collard greens that will just keep leafing and leafing all year long, and they're clearly happy together. This guy has the most fruit it's ever had on it, and I can see it starting to bud out. And so I started paying attention to this. Who played well together? Beets play well with other trees. They live well in the drip lines of trees, and they'll get auto watered from the drip line of the tree and thrive. And I don't pull the beet. I realize that I can get much more out of it if I just eat the greens off of it. And it turns out that beets aren't an annual. They actually will keep growing, and they'll flower and create more seed, and then they'll create more greens. And so, what was the other part of that question, Troy?
Let me hit that, Ed, because you mentioned greens, or your beet greens. So your beets are what's called a biannual, and they live for their first season, and then they go dormant, and then they flower the next spring. And those flowers, the end result are they're going to make seed for you, which one beet can put out 1,000 new beet seeds. But as they're flowering, they're bringing in all the pollinators that want the pollen and nectar from those flowers, but also the predators that will come in and take some of the nectar and pollen, but they'll also go in and hunt and eat caterpillars and other things that are in your garden. And that's really what integrated pest management is you're allowing a species that you might not want to be there, you're letting it come in and it do its thing, and then some other predator for that animal or bug or pest will come in and make itself at home and partake in the harvest. So like ladybugs are a great example. They're one of the most voracious hunters in your garden, and people think they're these cute little things, but the ladybug larvae, they call them like aphid lions, because they look like, or aphid alligators. They look like little alligators that hunt around your plants, and they eat the bad bugs. But then you also have pests like rats and squirrels and rabbits that come in and do their thing, and allowing them to partake in part of the harvest also brings in the owls, the hawks, and the coyotes that will also be eating those animals and kind of keeping them under control. And if you have a cat, they might be part of that integrated pest management too.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we started seeing in our system, was that was that, yeah, when we first started planting our garden, you put in that butter lettuce or whatever, and we joke around about how, these snails magically show up. I mean, they weren't even in your yard yet. You put in a bunch of tasty things and all of a sudden they're there in abundance. And we were pulling hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of snails at night out of our gardens, just freaking out, just, going, what is going on? And, what was funny was that what happened was that we ended up waiting and kind of stepping back from it and pausing. And I'm not sure really why that made me do it. Maybe I was just tired of pulling snails out of the garden, was just sick of it. But suddenly we had a rat move in, and this rat started eating all of our snails. I started seeing snail shells everywhere. And so then, the rat got a girlfriend and made a family, and I was kind of freaking out, going, oh my God, I got a rat problem. And then all of a sudden I started seeing half-eaten rats in our yard. And so I noticed that, bigger creatures were coming in our yard at night, whether it was wild or even just domestic cats were coming in and eating them. And so all of a sudden it balanced it. And every time we have too many snails show up, a rat comes in and then that rat gets taken out. So it's really interesting if you step back and not try to control it, but it takes some patience. But when we did that, the system started to balance itself, and it was really powerful to see that.
So let's take a step back. And we kind of jumped right into it, but for us beginners and like myself, what's the basic idea behind a regenerative garden versus your traditional garden? Ron, you want to start off with that?
Sure. Regenerative in itself is something having the ability to keep going, like, throughout the cycles. And we all know we have 4 seasons here, even though it doesn't feel like it in sunny San Diego. But each of those seasons, they bring certain things. They bring water in the fall and the winter, and then sun and whatever else in the spring. And what happens is you have this living and dying cycle throughout those months. But when you're regenerative, each of those cycles of death, they kind of put something back into the earth. So regenerative gardening is really hard to do if you're not composting. If you're throwing your cuttings and your green waste into your green bin and setting it out to the street, that's definitely not regenerative unless it's going to some compost facility and that material is coming back to your yard. But the easiest and best way to start being regenerative is to start composting and taking care of your soil. Ed, I'll let you go with the next part of that.
Yeah, so what we've sort of figured out is that, we figured out that our system, in order to be regenerative, we started to have to really look seriously at our soil. And so what that meant is that we really started to look at, if our soil is alive, how do we take care of it like an animal? Okay, so we got to feed it, we got to give it clean water, and we have to care for it. We have to give it sunscreen, which sounds funny, but yeah, that's even just what mulch is sunscreen. But so as we started to really, not just focus on the plants above ground, but we started to look at the soil, we started to look at our system and say, okay, so what can we do to close the loop from our own waste stream and then also feed it? And for us, it was taking our food waste and putting that back into the system. And we did that through Bokashi composting. I took a class from you, Ron, maybe I think 4 years ago or something, and we just started taking our food waste and putting that into our yard, and we really just started focusing on feeding it. And then we also started doing lots of mulch. We were getting free mulch. We were spreading that around our trees. And this is a time where we didn't have a lot of growth in it, so we couldn't just produce this on site. But as we did that and the trees got bigger, what happened was that all of this leafy material started to drop, and instead of us putting into our green bin and shipping it off, we let it build up. And then so suddenly we had this cycle where our soil was actually eating our waste, which was actually producing better plants and more abundance. And then again, they drop it back and it started to build the cycle. So regenerative home gardening is really about, finding ways of building a looped system so that everything is just cycling back and forth. And a huge part of that is your soil. And so that was the key for us. Once we figured out that we could start taking our 1,000 pounds of food waste a year and cycling that back into our soil, and then capturing, even through simple rainwater systems of just a bucket underneath, a trash can underneath, and using that water, which doesn't have chlorine, which doesn't kill our microbial. What that did is it started to generate worms in our system. And then now I would say that, we have a truly living system. We've got mushroom in our soil. We've got tons of worms and beneficial bugs. We've got all these things. And then, of course, it's growing the plants bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're dropping, and that's the cycle.
I got a question. I have dogs, and I'm dealing with foxtails, and I paid a lot of money getting those foxtails removed. And so, how do you guys deal with weeds? Like, are you pulling from the roots? Are you weed whacking them? And how is that incorporated into the whole regenerative aspect of your garden?
Ed, you start with your story on that one.
Okay, so for me, I look at weeds as a gift. I start to figure out what they are. I do two things. One is that I start to change the seed bank in my soil. So as there's weeds that I don't have a use for necessarily in terms of edibles, because I'm really focused on having a big edible landscape, I start to introduce more and more things that take their place. So, for example, arugula and mustard greens are really great ways for us to shade out, traditional weeds that we don't see as get a picture going. Yeah, so for example, this zone here was just that's a pathway that would have had weeds on it, but I let other plants I let mustard green go to seed. They fell in the pathway, they grew up. I've been eating these for months, and they blocked out all the other weeds. When they're done, they'll seed again, they'll produce more plants probably down the hill. I'll have my pathway back again, and I'll start over. The other thing is that anything that is undesirable for me, whether it's a foxtail or something, I learn what they are and then I cut them early. So I have an electric weed whacker. I may weed whack that down, but I'm actually going to take all of that material and drop it around the base of my tree. So you can kind of see down below, there's a bunch of just pieces of material. That was all weeds that were lying around, and I put them down there, and that creates a mulch and feeds my soil. So there's different ways. I personally look at them as an opportunity. I didn't have to go bring mulch in. I didn't have to move it around. It was just sitting there. I can just cut it really easily. I drop it, and I've just sort of learned to look at it as a bonus. Ron, how do you deal with it? Because you've got chickens and things, so you deal with things a little differently.
So there's certain weeds that pop up, and of course, like the foxtails that come up early. They're pretty vigorous, and if I'm not growing something in an area, which I'm on 3/4 acres, so I don't always have things growing in every square foot, and so weeds may come in if I didn't put mulch, or if it's time to put new mulch. So what I do is I like to pull those up, especially weeds that have shallow roots, I'll just pull them up and throw them to my chickens, and my chickens love me for it. They follow me around waiting for me to do stuff like that, because one, the bugs under those roots that they can access, and then just eating the greens from the weeds themselves. And so I don't get too upset about weeds. This was a very wet past 2 years, so we had a lot, and we also got an electric weed whacker. But instead of us throwing those greens into the trash can, they're going into piles or going into my compost pile. And what I prefer to do, though, is if I have an area that's growing weeds, I'm going to change the weeds that are growing there. I'm going to change the plant material that wants to come up. So I have what's called Mexican sunflower, which grows about 10 foot tall, and it'll grow that in the course of maybe 3 to 6 months, and it shades out the soil, which shades out the weeds. Most weed seeds need light to germinate. So if you cover your soil with mulch, they won't grow, or you cover your soil with some other plant, they won't grow.
Yeah, also, Ron, the as we're building soil, if we're cutting those weeds off above the root line, we're building biomaterial in the ground for the worms. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, I forgot, the other thing I do is I get free mulch dropped in, and I get I just put it on top of my weeds. So my weeding is really just dumping a bunch of mulch on top of my weeds, which then captures the nitrogen in those leaves and keeps it in the soil. And so really, it's just building an opportunity to build soil.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I'm getting a lot of questions about bokashi. Everybody's interested, and I know you guys can talk for hours about it.
Okay.
But another question I thought was super interesting from Diego, and I asked you earlier when we were talking, the picket fence in your garden, Ed, what's the purpose of that? What's the regenerative part of that?
It was, so the bottom of our yard, like if you remember the first picture, it was just, we didn't have any fence line, we didn't have anything. Part of this is just a process of personal expression. We went to a swap meet, and someone had a bunch of these fence pieces, and we just sort of put them out as decoration, and then we started planting next to them, trying to build some sort of fence line. It's kind of funny, you just improvise. Like I've done so much of this with as little budget as possible, and I've been inspired by other people who have done that, who have just kind of made funky things. But I do upcycling for a living, so that's kind of how I roll. But there's no real need. We're not keeping anybody out. It's just something we threw up there.
And one thing about putting non-natural structures in your garden is they create little nanoclimates. So you have a little fence like that one, you can grow something that sprawls like blackberries or something. What it ends up doing is on the north and south or east and west side of that, you have a different climate, because as the sun comes up, if anybody's ever looked at a seed packet, it says something like it needs morning sun and afternoon shade or something crazy like that. And when I first started gardening, it drove me crazy, because I'm like, how do you can't make that happen. You don't just have shade in the morning or evening. And then you start seeing how a plant can do that for you. So if you have the north side of your garden and it's shaded out in most of the day, but then midday it gets full sun, there's certain things you can do to mitigate that, and putting up little structures like that help.
Yeah, the microclimate thing is a whole subject in itself, but I agree. You can work magic. When you have a big open yard like yours and mine were originally, it's basically the same climate across the whole thing. you have just a big open space that's capturing the same sun. As soon as you start putting things in that space, at first, you could plant some trees or whatever. It takes a while for them to get big. But yeah, little knickknacks like that will actually help things find their little niche.